Iconography, a brief history of early iconography in the West. So who painted the first icon? Luke the physician. At the particular period of time that we're talking about, though, a physician also meant someone who was fully schooled in the classic areas of knowledge: rhetoric, mathematics, astronomy, and the arts. And so if Luke was a physician, he would have had extensive training. And one of those trainings would have been in painting and art. Pious opinion is such, and actually this is probably more true than not, that the very first icon was painted by St. Luke. It's not completely outside the realm of possibility, because he would have had training in this. The traditional icon that St. Luke painted first was of the Holy Virgin and Child. That's why he's the patron saint of iconographers. But I would venture to guess, and would like to posit, that the very first icon painted was by our Lord. This is the Shroud of Turin. The Shroud of Turin, 14 feet long, about almost 3 feet wide, piece of linen cloth. It is kept in the Roman Catholic Cathedral in the city of Turin. That's the Shroud of Turin. Wild history. Wacky wild. So as things are wont to do when you start to mix relics, Christianity, traditional Christianity, and science, the kind of high horse scientists thought, oh, well, we'll just disprove this in a second, you know? It's a medieval forgery, obviously. Anyone, couldn't be what it says that it, ha-ha. God giggled. This is probably the single most scientifically analyzed object on the planet. The problem for the scientist is the more that they study it, the more that they come to realize we don't know how this was done. For the folks that think it's a medieval forgery, that's just holding on probably to a particular bias and bigotry. Part of the reason why I want to bring this up very first is because this is part of the theological argument and justification for iconography. If God left us a picture of his face, God did it, and he's okay with his own leaving of a picture of his son's face, then would he really have a problem of us just duplicating it? Probably not. The more that this item gets studied, the more that they realize that there are things that are absolutely impossible for someone to forge. A medieval forger would not only have not known about pollen, but a medieval forger would not have been able to go around through Jerusalem in the spring at a particular time to particular plants and gather up pollen to work into the fabric. The blood stains, the way that the fluids are on the fabric, are only recent discoveries made by science about how blood reacts on fabric with certain other chemicals. I also think that in some ways this may be one of God's ways of preparing this particular age. We're so focused on science, we're so focused on what's real, that maybe God's getting to the point of, okay, look at this. This is real. Interesting thing about the shroud itself is it looks a whole lot like. This is Christ in the Sinai. This is one of the oldest existing Byzantine icons because the Byzantines had this little problem with something called iconoclasm. And if you look, that's Jesus. Just about anybody, including someone on the street with a secular background, could look at that and go, oh, Jesus. That image is so ingrained into our collective subconscious that what we do is when we see someone who has long hair parted down the middle and a beard, oh, they look like Jesus. Okay, that's how deep that image is. So there's the shroud, there's those two, and there they are overlaid. There are approximately 24 exact points of reference between the proportions on the Shroud of Turin and the icon of Christ. Length of the nose, spacing between the eyes, end of the eye to the ear, all of that kind of stuff. And it's one of those things, the more the scientists study it, the more that they realize this is something else. A huge amount of the scientists that study this wind up becoming Christian. So I wanted to show that because this particular image is the image. When we're talking about Christ, we're talking about the Word. But we're also talking about him being the image. He is the image of the invisible God. We haven't fully grasped, I think, and hold within ourselves what we mean when we talk about God became man. The phrase that I use is called the scandal of particularity. The scandal of particularity is, at a particular time, in a particular place, a particular man with a particular height, a particular weight, a particular smell, a particular hair color, was God. So if you think about that, it's not that he was walking around with a halo. He looked exactly like us. And to think about the idea that God was literally looked, acted, smelled just like us. So much so that if you were in the Judean grocery store getting your pomegranates, the guy next to you could be God in a real way. And you wouldn't be able to tell from looking at him. That's part of what this is all about. All iconography is based on the principle that at one time God had a face. This is an icon. This is called the Poetes, a Greek word which means not made by human hands. Gee, looks like the shroud. So much so that it usually has the fabric behind it. We call this icon also the Holy Face. One of the interesting things is this is a very old image. And they talk about having this image above the main gate going into Constantinople. One of the beginnings of the iconoclast controversy was the emperor and the patriarch. The emperor of Byzantium and the patriarch demanded that it be torn down. This will lead us kind of into some of the stuff about the iconoclasm controversy. But this is the way that it was always pictured. On the shroud itself, you can see fold marks of where at one time it was folded up in such a way that just the face showed. And it was kept like that for a while because of the way that the crease marks are and the way that the fabrics are bent and all that kind of stuff. So this is the kind of stuff that they're finding out that makes everyone kind of go, It makes sinners nervous. You guys have seen this image before, which is called Christ of the Golden Hair. Be aware that that face, that image, goes all the way back to the beginning. This is referenced in the Station of the Cross. Veronica, Saint Veronica, which maybe wasn't her name, because Vera Icona means true icon. She holds out a cloth, Christ lifts it up to his face, wipes off his face, and the image is left behind. Traditionally, that's called the mandilion. This is part of the wild stuff. There are cloths that exist in Western Europe, and they didn't know this until recently. There are 4 cloths that were used in a traditional burial for a Jewish person after crucifixion. One of these cloths was put around the head while it was still on the cross, tied up, because as the head went down, as they went to take the body off the cross, the blood that was still in the head and in the body would have come out. You can't lose any of the blood. That's part of the Jewish burial ritual. You have to get all the blood. So they would tie this cloth, and then when the body fell forward and all the blood came out, this cloth would catch it. That one has very different blood patterns. The other ones, there was a layering of fabrics on top of the body in the tomb. All 3 of these particular cloths, the blood stain patterns on them line up perfectly. So they're studying not only the shroud, but also the mandilion, something that's called the sudion. And again, the more they study them, hoping to disprove it, the more that they have to admit that they're finding stuff that's just beyond human hands. So with the Shroud of Turin, before the 5th century, Christ was depicted as a beardless youth. But if you go to Rome and you go into the catacombs, and the very few pieces of art that exist of Christ before the 5th century mainly show him as what would have been a traditional image for a Greco-Roman philosopher. No beard, a youth in a toga. The other image was a youth, no beard, as a shepherd. This radically changes at the beginning of the 5th century. So that's in the 400s. The interesting thing is that the first known location and display of the shroud was happening in the 5th century. So the hypothesis is that folks were painting Jesus, they didn't really know what he looked like. And again, we're talking about artists and stuff that are scattered over the entire Roman Empire. Very few people knew what he looked like. There is an apocryphal letter of Pilate in which he describes Christ. The interesting thing is he describes Christ the way that we see him now. So before the 5th century, Christ was depicted as a beardless youth, a karyopoetia, not made by human hands icon, was present in Constantinople as early as the 5th century. So what we're seeing here is the 5th century pretty much becomes the line of demarcation when icons of Christ, the way that we would recognize icons of Christ, begin to appear. Interestingly, this is also the same time that folks become aware of the image on the shroud. Okay? And mainly that's because the shroud was taken from Constantinople probably to France. One of the things that we in the West and in the East have a tendency to do is we take rabbinical Judaism, the Judaism that came to the forefront during the 6th, 7th, 8th century AD, and we project it backwards to that's what Judaism was like at the time of Jesus. It was not. It had ceremonies that are very, very, very similar to the ones that we do in church. And they weren't afraid to have images because they understood the difference between what an icon is and what idolatry is. So, just lest anyone think that when the apostles and such were getting together and listening to Jesus, that it was all in, 4 bare white walls and a pulpit. Nope, it looked like that. Interesting things also about this. There are ranks by stories. There are also individual images of individual folks, which we would call saints. This is 2nd century Judaism, Second Temple. So, a couple things about this. You'll notice that it's done in ranks, top and bottom, from the bottom up to the top. It's sectioned off to tell certain stories. If you took this image and you went to some of our Byzantine brothers and sisters and you said, "What is that?" they would say, "Oh, that's an old Greek church." And the thing is, you would have to get close enough to see that it's all written in Hebrew to be able to tell that it wasn't an old Greek church. These are the catacombs. An amazing experience, okay? It is down in the ground, and it is dark, and it can be very humid, and it is not pleasant, but it gives you such a sense of the history of early Christianity in a way that you just can't get reading a book. The interesting thing that I think about this is one of the oldest catacombs already. So they're under persecution. They're getting dragged out and lit on fire for Nero's garden to keep it lit. Animals are eating them. Peter and Paul have been executed. The faith is fully under attack. And yet, even though they're down in the ground, they go to all the work, because you got to light it. They don't, oil lamps, to decorate the inside. You would think the decoration would not be on their agenda. Survival would be on their agenda. But they took the time and they felt that it was important enough to go ahead and start to decorate. At the top of the arch there, that is the first picture of the Epiphany. This is between 2nd and 3rd century. So what does this tell us? By the end of the 3rd century, not only did they have imagery that was important enough to them for them to use it in a really deadly kind of situation. But we also can see that there's an establishment of feast. By this point, the Epiphany was a feast. That's what I'm talking about in what most of the images of Christ looked like prior to the 5th century. Okay? This is almost an icon of a prototype. So it's in no way trying to show what Jesus Christ of Nazareth looked like. It's using their own contemporary language and idiom in order to convey who he was and what he did. The image of the Good Shepherd is very important in this period because here you have this scattered flock under persecution and attack from the wolves, the Romans and everybody else. And so what this image becomes important to is that the Christ will come and gather us all back together and care for us as a shepherd cares for his sheep. Okay? The politics of the age drive, in a lot of ways, the iconography that's going on. This is one of the early. This is probably at the very beginning of the 5th century. This again is in the catacombs. This is the beginning, really, or the earliest image that they found yet of Christ and what we would associate Jesus looking like. Okay? So when I say beginning of the 4th century, what I mean is the 400s. Okay? Now what's interesting about that is that looks just like the image on the Shroud of Turin. But they don't really start talking about the Shroud of Turin until the 5th century. The only way that they could have had that would be as if the shroud was in Constantinople and was displayed prior to the 5th century. But here we have all the aspects of what we're looking for. The longer hair, parted in the middle, the longish but not too long beard, and you'll notice very importantly a halo and the Alpha and Omega on each side. This is the first image that really comes through as being about the divinity of Christ. All of the symbolism, all of the attributes that are there point to divinity. You would not do any of that if you thought who you're painting was just a guy. This here is a little bit later, about 75 to 100 years later, but already, and this is a catacomb painting, already the basic setup for depicting Christ in glory has been set. So you have Christ in the center, seated on a throne. On what would be your right side is St. Peter, on the left is St. Paul. The disciples and suppliants down underneath. The Lamb of God there in the center. That's pretty much the image of the deesis. Okay, you can find this image or variations of it in practically all of the domes or the apses in the churches in Europe. This particular icon, one of the earliest that is existing. When I say earliest icons, what I mean are the earliest existing icons. This particular icon is of St. Peter. It's from the Sinai Peninsula, St. Catherine's. St. Catherine's in the Sinai is a very important depository of images, books, holy hardware, all of that kind of stuff, because it was outside the realm of the Byzantine Empire during the iconoclast controversy. I'm only going to give you general dates on the iconoclast stuff because people disagree about when it started, when it ended. But we're basically talking for a century, and I want everyone to hear this. For a century, the official position of the Eastern Roman Orthodox Empire, icons were not allowed. They were burned, they were destroyed, mosaics were destroyed, things were torn down. Monks who were 4 icons. By the way, it's the monastics and the women that saved the icons. One of my own particular patron saints, Saint Lazarus, the iconographer, he refused to stop painting icons. He didn't care what the patriarch or what the emperor said. They took his hands and pushed him down onto glowing red-hot plates, like iron plates. That might cause you to hesitate a little bit. No, he learned how to paint icons with his mouth. This is the level of persecution that we're talking about, okay? This came about for all kinds of reasons, not the least of which is part of Byzantine history is you have to study the wars that are going on. Byzantium, like Rome, was not used to ever losing any wars. And the problem was they started losing battles, okay? At the same time, Islam had become a major player. So the Islamic military, the Islamic kings and sultans and satraps said, well, the reason why you're losing is because you're idolaters. And so people, the generals, mainly army folk, started, oh, no, that has nothing to do with it. Well, and then they kept losing. The Islamic folk kept taunting us, well, it's because you're all idolaters. Of course you're going to lose. And so they started to kind of think, maybe that is why we're losing. Okay? And so once this thought kind of gets into their head, because let's not forget that the second or third, depending on the counting, commandment is do not make graven images. Okay? There's always been tension between the role of iconography and the commandment against graven images. But my point is that in order to understand that, you have to understand the difference between icons and idols, but also, too, the understanding that things started going south for Byzantium, and they just weren't used to it. And so they started to think, well, maybe it's true. The emperor said, well, it's got to be true because I can't lose. And so through this tension with the commandment about no graven images, the taunting of the Islamic culture and empire at that time, and military folks, for the most part, like things nice and clean and straight and simple, okay? Icons are, and icon theology is anything but clean, straight, and simple, okay? So military folks, and again, kind of think about it. We're either losing because of this picture or because you're a bad general. Oh, it's the picture's fault. So that's some kind of background stuff on the iconoclast controversy. The theological part was certainly there, but it was not the dominant reason. The dominant reason was political and military. But the commandment about images is always lingering there in the background. The reason that St. Catherine's became so important is because it was outside the empire. The emperor had no control over it. And so from St. Catherine's and in Rome is where we find the oldest icons, because they weren't destroyed, because of the large population of Christians in Rome, and because the Bishop of Rome was not an iconoclast. In the West, iconoclasm did not become a really big thing until that unfortunate fat man from England, Henry VIII. This is an icon of St. Peter. A few things to notice about it is, again, up at the top, Christ in the center with the cruciform halo, okay? Recognizable face. To his right-hand side, the Theotokos. On the other side is probably either the patron saint of the person that commissioned the icon or possibly one of his children who died. Other important things about this. Look at the style. That's a pretty realistic kind of style. This guy is not really concerned about strokes and everything else. He's trying to get as visually realistic an image as he can. There's some abstraction, some of the clothes, the shadows and stuff in the clothes, you'll automatically realize and see that this area here, up around the neck, is immediately identifiable as traditional iconographic methods to paint clothes. So, what does it look like? It looks like an icon, okay? Now, if it was all cleaned up and all the little lacunae were filled in and everything else, and it was made to, you know, look like it did the day that it was finished, people wouldn't know whether it was an old one or a new one. The other thing that's important about this is look at the background. There on each side of the halo, those are architectural elements, okay, which is usual in kind of portrait stuff of this time. And you will notice it is in realistic one-point perspective. It means that as you look, things that are farther away recede into the horizon, okay? Remember this, because this becomes important later. So, one of the various early icons, it's not only recognizable as an icon, it has one-point perspective, and the painting is what we would consider today to be what would be colloquially called loose. This is done in what's called encaustic. This is a wax-based paint. This is a wax-based icon, okay? Most of the early icons are encaustic. This is called Peter of the Sinai. Another important thing is to notice what he has in his hand. It's a big staff cross. This is what the bishops used to carry before it was the little curly thing. For those that think that how could we possibly know what these people actually looked like, I will put before you for your approval the two earliest pictorial representations of Peter and Paul. Not only are they recognizable, you can look at it and go, oh, that's Peter and that's Paul, but we're talking about 2nd century. The people that painted this could have known Peter and Paul. Okay? All of the iconographic attributes, Peter, short curly hair, fluffy white beard. He's the guy on your left. Paul, balding, longer dark beard. That is exactly the same way that we paint it today. So this kind of, again, blows apart the idea that, oh, we're just making this stuff up. Well, if we are, we're making it up based on the fact that we have descriptions from people that saw them. This is another one of the ancient icons. This obviously is Our Lady enthroned with the Holy Child, saints on each side, angels behind. That's its technical name. This is encaustic, and this is big. Okay, big size, Rome. And this is pretty much, again, same period. So we're talking about late 600s, early 700s. Okay, still pretty early. And it's a fully realized image. The painting style, the medium, the composition, the elements that are there. So what we're talking about is pretty much by the 6th century, iconography is becoming set. The Jell-O is setting in the fridge, okay? It's starting to become something that's solid. You'll notice that this image is just like any variety of images of Our Lady seated on a throne, the Christ child in her lap. His robe is the gold with all the little lines through it. Little thing about Our Lady in blue versus Our Lady in maroon. The most expensive color in the East was called kochiel. It comes from a single tiny little drop found in the bottom of a mussel that lives at the bottom of the bay around the Constantinopolitan area. Very difficult to get, and you got to get a whole boatload of these mussels in order to get just a little bit of this dye. And it's a maroon color. Really, when we talk about purple, most of the time our ancestors were not talking about that kind of blue-based, kind of violet color. What they're talking about is actually kind of a reddish maroon that tends towards blue. That was the royal purple. Only emperors and nobility could wear this. The lowest strata of society that could have anything that was the royal purple was a centurion. If you were caught wearing the royal purple and you were not of that rank, say goodbye to your head. Okay, this is how serious they took it. Part of the break with Byzantium in 1054 has to do with a roll of purple cloth. So here we have Our Lady in blue. So in the West, the most expensive color was lapis lazuli, which is a blue. It was the most difficult to get. You could only get it from the mountains of Afghanistan, some places in Pakistan, and it's that vibrant, beautiful blue, okay? So you have the most expensive color in the East being this cautial kind of purple. In the West, the most expensive color is lapis lazuli blue. You're painting an icon of the Mother of God, Queen of Heaven, Our Lady, the All-Holy Theotokos. Mom gets the best stuff. So if you're in the West, what's the best you got? The blue. If you're in the East, what's the best you've got? The purpley red. Those two distinctions about the colors came first. Then all of the spiritual attributes about it, it represents the flesh, it represents the divinity, all those kinds of things, those came later. As with most things in iconography, the practical aspect of it comes first, the other part comes later. This is another one of the same time period of Our Lady. Again, the reason I wanted to show you guys this one is this is not only one of the oldest ones, but this is in Rome to this day, and I have seen it, and I was literally knocked to my knees. It's the spiritual power that comes off this icon is amazing. It's breathtaking. It's quite damaged, okay? But and it's big. Again, we're talking big. It just overwhelms you. You know that you are in the presence of something that is divine. Not that the icon itself is divine, but you feel like you're in the presence of someone very, very important. All of these icons that we've just seen are panel paintings. Okay, so they're on wood panels. The painting on the walls has been going on all along, but there were different degrees of value. The highest value was mosaic on the wall, okay? The lowest value was either, depending on the materials used, painting on a wall or painting on a board. This comes by different names. There's a Greek name for it and a Latin name for it that basically translates as Queen of Heaven. But if you go online and you look up the icons of Mary in Rome, this is one of the ones. Here we have our beloved Saint Mary, Sancta Maria Antiqua, or the old Saint Mary's. This also is in Rome. This is kind of a really cool story. This church was buried in the 9th century to build another church on top of it. God giggled and said, I'm just going to hold on to this for a little bit. So the church was completely buried, okay, and another church was built on top of it. Thank goodness, because when it was rediscovered at the end of the 19th century, we have a picture of what a fully iconized Western Roman Rite church looks like. And that's what it looks like. This obviously was the model for a lot of the stuff that we have here at St. Michael's. But again, look, it's in the layered. It's layered. It has the lineup of the figures around. By this time, this is the way you paint churches. This was going on between the 7th and 9th century. Here's the original of the crucifix that we have here in the church. This is so early that crucifixion still held some of its shame factor. It's difficult for us to really imagine the shame felt by not only the crucified, but to say that a crucified person was God is absolutely out of the question for the culture at this time. Because there was no more shameful way to die than crucifixion. Crucifixion was not only about inflicting pain, but it was also about inflicting shame. Okay? You're naked, nailed to a cross. You're bleeding, shaking, perspiring in the freezing cold, and you're just there for the whole world to see. So, very few of the early crucifixion scene show Christ unclothed. It was still just too much for him, okay? And so this is going on even into the 6th, 7th, 8th, into the early 9th century. You can kind of see him here. Up at the top where you see the two circles, one is the sun and one is the moon. The reason for doing that is because that was, in the language of the time, a way to signify that the crucifixion was a cosmic event. It was a way to place it into the context of eternity. What happened at the crucifixion affected not only that little town, that little country, the world, it affected everything. You'll also notice that on those two, the sun and the moon that's on the altar here, is they're both shamefaced. Creation was ashamed at what mankind did to the Creator. And so the language, and especially a lot of the beautiful hymns, talk about creation was shamefaced at the act of man. The sun hid its face from the degradation that the King of the universe endured at the hands of man. If anyone asks you, why does the crucifixion above your church not have Jesus naked? What's he got on? It's called a tunicle. And also the thing is, it has the two gold bands down it. This one, the color is kind of faded, but if you see really good reproductions of it, the robe in the middle is more of the royal purple. The two gold bands running down each side, only the emperor could wear that. So it's making a very profound spiritual statement and theological statement. This one who we crucified is the king and emperor of the universe. To depict that with the gold bands running down it in the 3rd century would have gotten you a quick ticket to Nero's garden. So it's a very political statement. This is the kind of thing that just makes art historians giggle with glee. This is one of the walls in Sancta Maria Antiqua, and it's layer upon layer upon layer upon layer of iconography. And they can identify the different icons by age. So this shows kind of the development of iconography through the history of this church. The interesting thing is that the oldest image of all is up there in the top right. It's also the most realistic looking. As you move forward through the timeline, the center picture of the face there of the gentleman is probably the most abstracted. And he's actually the latest. So we see this movement from very realistic, which would be completely recognizable as Greco-Roman painting, to a more abstracted and a simpler style. Spain, Romanesque. The funny thing about this is when you see that, you giggle, okay? Because it's just a style that we don't relate to. And I think probably the reason that we don't relate to it is because of things like cartoons, animation, things like that. But this was the height of fashion in 7th, 8th, 9th century, turn of the millennium, Europe. So when we talk about Romanesque iconography, this is what we're talking about. Now, I have grown to have great appreciation for this. But when we were getting ready to do the church, one of the things that was under consideration is what style should we use? The orthosphere has an idea that if Western Rite is allowed to exist, then they should have to paint it in Romanesque style. Only the style that existed before 1052. Well, that drops us right into the middle of the Romanesque. I love Romanesque. The architecture that we have here basically is Romanesque. But if I was to do all the iconography in that style, people would hate it. But a few things that are important about this is you'll notice from the icons that were earlier that they were much more realistic, okay? They were relatable as human beings. What we have going on here is full abstraction. The human being is reduced almost to a glyph. Not all of that is bad, because what this does is this takes it out of the realm of the particular and puts it into the realm of the more universal or cosmic. So what's happening is individuals are now being depicted as being units in the body of Christ. This was also a big period of time about the theological arguments about what does it mean to be a church. This is also Spain. So this is, again, like the other one that I showed earlier, Christ in glory, you'll notice. Seated on a throne, what's called the tetramorph, or the four holy angels around him. The lettering, the Alpha and the Omega, the angels are there, and it's a strict hierarchy. So Christ is at the top, and down here are the saints. Just like that picture we saw before, okay? The iconography had been set about 300 years earlier, but now it's just continuing on. Another Spanish one, this actually is from the monastery. This is what is above our relic altar. When you spend time with it, you start to get kind of affectionate towards it. You know, there's a certain kind of naivete and sweetness that comes with it. This is a church in England. So, again, now we're into the late 11th century, okay, in England. Wow, that looks a whole lot like the picture of the synagogue in Europa, okay? One of the reasons why I wanted to show some English pictures here, the only reason that this still exists is because they were doing a remodel and a refurbishing on this church, and they chipped away on the plaster and the whitewash, and they found this underneath. So they decided maybe we should chip some more stuff off and see what we find. The other part of it is the inside of these English churches, as was every church in Europe, highly decorated, okay? When we think of cathedrals now, what color do you think the inside is? White, stone, gray. At the time that they were built, bright colors everywhere. Stones that were inlaid with metal, okay? Icons everywhere, okay? Not painted on the walls, though. We'll talk a little bit about how that changed. But we got to get over this idea that old churches were blank. They were not. They were super bright colored. North of England, there's that same scene again, okay? Christ in the center in glory, angels and saints gathered around him. This one's kind of fun. On the left is St. Christopher. On the right is Christ the King of Glory, or Christ the Bridegroom, with the flagellation. Folks in England, when these were uncovered, were scandalized. They were scandalized because they had such a sophisticated history of really English religion, completely devoid from all of those silly European, Southern European superstitions. Nope, you guys got them too. Again, this is England. This is a very familiar scene to those of us that for around Paschaltide, the deposition from the cross and the entombment. If you were to overlay this or side by side this with a Greek icon, This one would just look like it was more simplified, but all the exact same elements are there. This is Italy, and this is one of the very first fully decorated Benedictine churches and monasteries. The Benedictines were one of the very first to really push the idea of the decorations in churches, because to have liturgy without a fully decorated church was not complete. You had to have the icons to have a full liturgy. This is also from about the same period in Italy. What I want you to notice is, notice the face on this and kind of compare it with the faces of the saints that are here in St. Michael's up high. This was one of the models that I used. Again, you see we've gone from hyper-realistic, or pretty realistic, to, again, this more abstracted style. Italy again, there's that figure again, okay? It just repeats over and over and over in 1,000 different styles in 1,000 different ways, but the basic image is the same. There's a modern version. That's modern, okay? That's English, done by Aidan Hart, for those of you that are familiar with Aidan Hart. But you can see that even when it's modern, and now there are things about this that have kind of been cleaned up. The proportions have been regularized, the lettering and the fabric and the colorization has been given a more uniform kind of feel, but you can do ancient Romanesque icons and make them appealing. You just have to work a little harder. This is Our Lady of the Stinky Diaper, one of my favorites. That's really not the title, but this is to show kind of quickly the evolution of, in the West, from the Byzantine to a more recognizable Western style. This is full Byzantine. The only thing that's kind of different is the fact that in this particular icon, her robe is blue instead of maroon. But the painting style, the proportions, the way that it's all done, absolutely Byzantine, okay? And it's a beautiful icon. If you can find pictures of this with ultra high resolution, the way that the iconographer has balanced warm and cool tones in the face, a couple of little light sky blue lines here, a few little pinkish red lines there, and it's beautiful. It looks like jewelry, okay, the way that he's managed warm and cool tones. So here is where we have one artist, or actually a studio of artists, and you can see full Byzantine, okay? Not a thing about that isn't Byzantine, all right? But this is in the West, this is in Italy, this is around Florence, okay? This is part of what's called the Trivium, the three great artists of this particular period that really are the linking points between early Byzantine in the West and what we would call the Western canon. So these three particular artists that really set the tone for where Western art was going to go is Giotto. The other one is a man called Duccio. And the other one, who's a little bit later but almost contemporaneous, Fra Angelico. Those three guys pretty much set the trajectory of where Western art was going to go. But what's interesting about it is in their own work, you can see this transition from a fully Byzantine style to a more realized Western style. Beautiful, lovely, still pretty much Byzantine, but what you can see is the fabric is softening a little bit. It's not quite so abstracted. It's not just about angles and straight lines. There's actually an attempt here to try to get the idea of volume. There's an attempt to get the idea of the volume in the space. The volume of the child occupies its own space. The figure of the Theotokos, she has weight, form, and volume to her, but still fully recognizable as Byzantine influence. If you take an art historian and you show them this picture and another Byzantine style icon from the exact same period, it's hard to really point out what the differences are. It's more a difference of feeling. Okay, this one feels a little bit different, a little bit more realistic, a little bit moving away from the abstraction back towards the more realistic depiction of faces and stuff, a softening of the fabric, and an idea that we're talking about bodies, okay, that there's a dimension to them. This is the beginning of kind of where the Byzantine iconographies and Byzantine iconographers started to get a little nervous when you start talking about volumes and space. Here, another icon from the period, fully identifiable as Byzantine style. But you'll notice that in the background, the rocks and stuff, while still the kind of abstracted geometric forms that you see in Byzantine iconography of rocks and trees and that kind of stuff, it's starting to feel like it's taking place in a space. The leaves are kind of recede. The rocks have a feeling that they're receding out. You're looking at something that's taking place in a definable space, okay? This was revolutionary. This is the kind of thing that, just like the rites of spring, caused riots. This is the first depiction of the Virgin Mary where she actually looks like she has a woman's body. Okay? Now, the thing is, there have been dozens and dozens of icons of what's called the Virgin Lacrimia, the Virgin feeding, you know, Christ and the Virgin, and she's breastfeeding, frankly. But everything was really flattened, okay? It was way more abstract. Here we have a woman, a real woman. This was scandalous. Look at the throne, okay? The throne is pretty much using what we would consider normal perspective. There's recessive perspective, there's reverse perspective, but the throne looks like a real throne. But again, compare this one to one that was about 10 pictures ago. You have the Virgin with the Holy Child sitting on a throne with the angels and saints around. The basic iconography is the same. The style has changed a bit. This is Duccio. This is the beginning of early Gothic. These come from the Basilica of St. Francis in Assisi. Wow, that really looks like an icon. I bet if I took someone who was really unfamiliar with the different schools and stuff, and I said, tell me where this came from, they might say Greece. Okay? The way that the fabric is handled, the way that the faces are handled, the general composition, it's very iconographic. Okay? It's flat, but there's little things that are starting to happen. The faces are starting to have a certain expression. You can look at those faces and tell, especially with the face of the woman, who would be Rachel, and Isaac there in front of her, that she looks kind of nervous, looking to the side. Well, because she's set up the fact that she's going to fool Isaac, they're trying to fool him. He's blind. So you'll notice that on his hands are some sheepskins, and around his neck is a sheepskin. She's trying to fool. You'd be nervous too, especially if it was a prophet of God. So here's it from the same series up close. You'll see that, again, she's touching the fabric. Again, that's revolutionary, that they would interact with the objects around them. There's a certain tension on their faces, and a certain realism mainly brought about not through perspective or anything, but more about they actually paid attention to the details on the decoration of the fabric. Here is Western art starting to pay attention to things like, how does light actually go through a glass space? What does that look like? Okay, this is where the Byzantines lost their mind, because of the buildings, okay? And not only the buildings, but the fact that this scene is fraught with emotion. Look at how the eyes of the people on the side are kind of shifting back and forth. How they're looking at it. Can you believe what we're seeing? You know, it's depicting emotion. It's depicting the feeling of distress. This is worlds away from the placid, non-expressive idea that what you're looking at is so transcendent that it can't do anything as base as display human emotion. Now, what was going on theologically at the same time is the idea that being a human is okay. This is the beginning of Christian humanism, where we started looking at actually the human being as something created good by God. This got a real kind of pounding thanks to our friend Dr. Calvin, who wanted to go back to the idea that the only thing worthwhile about a human being is that maybe someday they would be good enough to get into heaven. Okay? But this is the beginning of the idea that God created us and that God loves us. Let me rephrase that. That's not the beginning of that idea. This is the beginning of the artistic representation of that idea. This is from the Basilica of St. Francis in Assisi. What's happening here is this is when St. Francis, who's always fighting with his father is a rich merchant, okay? St. Francis has had this realization that poverty is everything and money and things don't mean anything. His dad, who is rather against this idea, takes him, locks him up. Francis is let out by his mother, who feels sorry for her poor son who's starving to death in a dark hole. You can still see the dark hole. And Dad takes him before the magistrates and before the bishop and says, "This is not my son." And Francis says, "You're absolutely right. And I give you back everything that belongs to you." He takes off all of his clothes and hands them back to his father. The bishop, who's recognizing this guy's either crazy or he's moving towards theosis, is wrapping him in his cloak. This is the scene where the difference between, and again, you have to understand the culture at the time. What Francis was saying about God's love was revolutionary. And what he was saying about God's love for others, revolutionary. What he was saying about God's love for the poor, over the top, okay? But the bishop, this is when he recognizes he's either mad or he's a saint. This really, the reason why I'm pretty much stopping here is because this is the beginning of what would really be considered the split between Eastern art and Western art. It's kind of a false dichotomy, but this would be the point at which the strictly Byzantine iconographers would say the West went off the rails. Depicting emotion, depicting things in space, depicting things using a more mathematically based perspective, okay? But now I want to take you all the way back to the beginning. What did the earliest icons, so let's use Peter as an example. Remember the Sinai Peter? The perspective was one-point perspective that looked like real architecture. The painting was depicting someone that looked like a real person. The clothing was somewhat abstracted, but at the same time, he looked like a real guy you could meet, okay? Not a bunch of lettering all over the place, okay? Not a bunch of titles, no red and white bands around the halo with the interminable argument of which one goes on the outside. Really, the Peter one looks like it could have been painted, you know, by at least a friend of this guy, okay? The same with the Christ Sinai. So what we see is we see this movement from more realistic, more in the tradition of art as something that depicts reality, into a movement towards abstraction and everything else, where the Romanesque, that first Romanesque picture that I showed you, People are individual cogs. They really don't have their own faces. And now we're coming back to the idea of perspective, life figures, showing emotion, that kind of stuff. This is another one from St. Francis. Again, look at how the town is in the background. That's just wild. Oh, he beeth done. Praise God. Thank you for your interest and long suffering. Thank you, Father. Come to part 2.